Hello guys, welcome back to a new video after the Chinese Grand Prix. We saw some very interesting things in this race weekend. The race itself didn't start exactly as we hoped, with the double DNS for McLaren and the sad news about the cancellation of the Bahrain and Saudi Arabia races. But despite that, the race still ended with a very interesting result and a podium that many people probably didn't expect. So let's go through the race from the start. The race started with Kimi Antonelli on pole position, with Russell behind him, followed by Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc. But the third row was empty because both McLarens had different issues before the start, so neither of them actually started the race. When the race began, Hamilton quickly jumped into first position. Leclerc tried to attack Antonelli as well, but he couldn't complete the move. Russell also dropped a few places early on, and Verstappen once again seemed to have some problems at the start. We saw several cars going past him almost immediately. So right from the first lap, we already had some interesting fights between the Mercedes and the Ferraris. Antonelli did a very strong job during the race. Maybe the question came up again, is it the car or the driver? But he really proved that he can perform under pressure. We even saw him lock up in the final laps. And that same mistake earlier in the race could have easily cost him the win or even the race itself while fighting the Ferraris. So he definitely deserves credit for keeping the car under control and managing the pressure. Now, about Ferrari. The Ferraris looked very strong during this race. We'll continue talking about them a bit later in the video, but one thing that stood out was how good the car looked in the corners. Even the Mercedes drivers mentioned this after the race. Hamilton later said that without the straights, Ferrari could have been able to beat Mercedes. But Mercedes had a clear advantage on the straights, and that was Ferrari's main limitation. Apart from that, Ferrari showed very strong pace. The car looked very stable and had strong grip, especially during the starts and after the safety car. We saw both Ferrari drivers overtaking Russell during one of those phases, which showed how good their grip was on cold tires. Russell even complained on the radio that he had no grip at that moment, which allowed the Ferraris to attack. One of the most interesting parts of the race was the fight between Hamilton and Leclerc. To be honest, it was a very intense battle. Even if you are not a Ferrari fan, or maybe if you support Mercedes, at some moments you might even think maybe they crash. But at the same time, you really didn't want to see that happen. It was extremely tense. The funny part is that Charles Leclerc said after the race that it was a fun fight, while fans watching the race were basically on their toes the entire time, worried that the cars might touch. Hamilton later said they actually had a small touch between the cars, but luckily it didn't turn into anything serious. And that was very important because we had already lost the McLarens, and the Red Bulls were not competitive in this race either. So losing one of the Ferraris would have been a big loss for the race itself. Both drivers really deserve credit for their experience and driving skills. At some points, the distance between the cars was literally paper thin, and they still managed to keep the fight clean and avoid a crash. Now let's talk about what the Chinese Grand Prix revealed about the 2026 cars, especially on long straights. Mercedes clearly had an advantage on the straights compared to the rest of the grid. But what made the race interesting was how positions could change depending on the section of the track. Sometimes a car could overtake easily on the straight, but then lose that position again in the corners. And sometimes the opposite would happen. A car would defend on the straight, but lose time in the corners. So it created a very tricky situation for the drivers. But honestly, this is somewhat expected with completely new regulations and a new generation of cars. Another big topic this season will be energy deployment and how drivers manage it during the race. Several drivers talked about this after the race. Leclerc mentioned that these new cars require a lot of thinking about where to deploy energy and where to save it. Engineers also talked about how important it is to balance straight line speed with battery deployment across the lap. That's something we will probably keep seeing throughout the season, and hopefully it will result in better races rather than worse ones, especially when more teams start catching up with Mercedes and Ferrari. For example, if McLaren had started the race, we could have possibly seen a very interesting fight between McLaren and Ferrari. Based on what we saw earlier in the weekend, those two teams look quite competitive with each other. Right now, though, Mercedes already seems to be pulling slightly ahead. Another disappointing part of the race was the Red Bull performance. Hajar actually had a very good start, but the car spun and he lost several positions. Verstappen also struggled during the race and eventually had to retire because of technical issues. So overall, it was not a very good race for Red Bull. Combined with the McLaren situation and Oscar Piastri missing another race start, it was definitely a frustrating weekend for several teams. However, there were also some very positive surprises. Haas and Alpine both did a fantastic job in this race. Colapinto was even fighting near the front of the field at one point and briefly looked like he could challenge for a very high position before the race settled again for the top teams. Later, he dropped back to where the Ferrari and Mercedes pace was simply too strong, but it still showed that Alpine had a competitive car during parts of the race. We should also give a lot of credit to Oliver Bearman. Finishing fifth with Haas is a fantastic result. When you compare that performance with his teammates' result, it becomes even more impressive. Bearman drove a very clean race and took advantage of every opportunity. If he continues performing like this, it would not be surprising to see him fighting for a Ferrari seat in the future. Finally, we also need to talk about Aston Martin. Unfortunately, Alonso had another difficult race. He eventually had to retire because the car had strong vibrations, and he said after the race that he could barely feel his hands anymore. So Aston Martin clearly still has some serious issues to solve with the car. Now, regarding the new regulations, opinions among drivers and engineers are still mixed. Some drivers like Leclerc said that the new cars can be fun to race when the energy deployment works well and the cars are close together. But others, including Verstappen, were much more critical. He mentioned that the new cars rely too heavily on electrical energy management and that drivers sometimes feel like they are managing systems more than actually racing. Engineers also pointed out that teams are still learning how to extract the best performance from the new power units and energy systems. Because these regulations are still very new, the competitive order can change quite quickly as teams understand the cars better. Looking at the competitive order after China, Mercedes currently looks like the strongest overall package. Ferrari seems to be the closest challenger, especially in race pace and cornering performance. McLaren is still a bit of an unknown because of the reliability issues this weekend, but the car showed some promising speed earlier in the weekend. Red Bull clearly still needs to solve some problems with the new car. And in the midfield, teams like Haas and Alpine are showing that they can take advantage of opportunities and score big points when things go their way. Looking ahead to the next races, the big question will be whether Ferrari or McLaren can close the gap to Mercedes. We will also see how quickly Red Bull can recover and whether the midfield teams can continue challenging for strong results. If the development race continues at this pace, the season could become even more competitive as teams start understanding the 2026 regulations better. So overall, the Chinese Grand Prix gave us a lot to think about for the rest of the season. And if this is the level of fighting we're going to see between Mercedes and Ferrari, then the next races could become very interesting.